Hello and welcome to Course 2, Communicating with Creditors. This is the second course in a five-part course series called How to Fix Your Credit for Free. You can find the course listing at autumnlee.online, and you can find the VODs at autumnleesnews.com on the live page or at my Rumble page, which is also located at autumnleesnews.com on the live page. So thank you for being here. Welcome to Course 2, Communicating with Creditors. So today we will be discussing how and when to communicate with creditors, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and how and when to communicate with process servers. So we'll go into a little more detail about what process servers are, and what it means for you if you're at that stage in your credit journey. Okay, so the best way to communicate with any creditor is in writing. The main reason for this is because many times creditors and debt collectors will use underhanded tactics that violate the Fair Debt Collections Practices Act if you communicate over the phone. Calls are not always recorded on their end. You can try to record calls, but you must disclose you're doing that, or you risk violating the law if you tend to use your recording in court. So if you want to record phone calls with creditors to try to catch them violating the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, you would have to literally disclose to them that you're recording this phone call. So you'd have to remember to do that every time. I think on Apple iPhone, when you record a call, it automatically says that, so you don't have to remember it. So if you really want to do that, you can do it that way if you'd like to, but it's easier not to. Communication in writing is much more expedient and allows you a way to keep track of your conversations with creditors so that you're not having to record your calls. Law firms sometimes contact you on behalf of creditors when the debt is large, and the creditor has been unsuccessful in reaching you to collect. Sometimes third-party collection agencies will retain a law firm to help them collect the debt. Sometimes they'll sell it to a law firm. Sometimes the law firm itself is actually the third party collection agency. You should communicate with them the same way in writing. Process servers. Now, process servers are people who come to you to serve you with a court summons, ordering you to appear in court because a creditor is suing you for your debt. Um, Now, it's important to note that smaller debts, like anything lower than $1,500, you're not going to get sued for that. It's possible, but you're probably not going to because it would cost them more to do that for less than $1,500 than it would for, say, if you owe 5,000. You're probably going to get sued for that. 10,000, you're probably going to get sued. 2,500, you're probably going to get sued. Anything over $1,500 in consumer debt, you could potentially be facing a lawsuit if you go into default and don't take care of it before it gets there. It takes a long time to get there, but if you have large debts, they can get to the point where you're actually being sued. Depending on where you are, though, communicating with process servers may not be necessary, but it is important to pay attention to their communication with you and note any dates on any court orders. So you definitely don't want to ignore that. So the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, it is against federal law for a debt collector to lie to you to collect a debt. You will not go to jail if you don't pay most consumer debts. If you are at risk of incarceration due to a debt, it's highly unlikely that you'll receive a phone call from a debt collection agency. These types of debts are typically owed to state or federal agencies, not consumer merchant creditors. So if you catch a debt collector violating the FDCPA, you can sue them and win, as long as you can prove it. The FDCPA also specifies how harassment and abuse is defined and what legal actions debt collectors can take. If you're being inundated by bill collectors and you simply want the phone calls to stop, you can send each creditor a cease and desist order, and you will no longer receive any phone calls. You will then need to correspond in writing, and so will they, but only upon your first contact. So if you're just, starting this horrible downward spiral with your credit and you're getting all these phone calls right in the initial stages of, 30 days late, 60 days late, 90 days late, 120 days late. And so you're getting calls upon calls upon calls. You tell them not to call you, they're not going to stop calling you because by law they can. Up to 3 times a day, they can call you. You can tell them if they're calling your place of business, your workplace, you can tell them not to call your place of business, but they can call your home up to 3 times a day. It is legal for them to do that. But if you're just sick of it, you can send your creditors a cease and desist order, which essentially tells them you cannot contact me about this debt any longer over the phone. You can word it however you would like to word it. There are templates online, but you can send this to your creditors and then the phone calls will stop. And then at that point, what you'll need to do, which of course you're going to know that it's this right here, what you're going to know what you need to do at that point. You're going to need to correspond with them in writing. At that point, you'll then need to correspond in writing, and so will they, but only upon your first contact. So you'll go through your credit report and then you'll write letters to the addresses that are actually connected to each creditor at that point. But it is 100% perfectly legal for you to send a cease and desist order to your creditors so that they can't call you. It doesn't absolve you of the debt. You still have to pay the debt, but they can't call you. Anyway, I'll try to pull up some of those later on in the course. But this is just the presentation portion of it here. So. And so now the Fair Credit Reporting Act is different from the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. They're both kind of, like conjoined, but they're different acts. The Fair Credit Reporting Act protects consumer information that is reported by the credit bureaus, reporting agencies, and creditors, ensuring accurate information. The FCRA ensures that all legal reporting obligations are met by all 3 credit reporting agencies, including disputed debts investigations. So we touched on that in course 1 about disputing inaccuracies, disputing debts that are invalid. The FCRA oversees basically the dispute investigations, ensures that the credit bureaus and creditors are abiding by the law, that all legal reporting obligations are being met by the 3 credit bureaus or credit reporting agencies, TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. So it's kind of like an umbrella act that protects consumers' information on their credit reports. So again, about process servers and how you want to communicate with them. I'd like to say that in some states it's actually illegal to avoid process service. So you don't want to consciously avoid process service if you suspect that you're being served with court papers. That can be illegal in some states depending on what you're being served with. Um, Process servers serve court papers. So if you are being sued for an old debt, you'll likely be visited by a process server who is trying to serve you with court papers. These court papers will contain a court date for when you're to go before a local judge to talk about your debt. You can generally ignore process servers. If you don't know who's knocking, then just don't open the door. However, with consumer debts, process servers can often leave the court paperwork in a conspicuous area at your place or residence or business and call it service of process. So they can go to your place of residence or your place of business, and in some states they could just tape it onto your door, and that's service. Other states they could take out an ad in the paper with your name, the court date, what it's about, and that's service. It depends with consumer debts. So it doesn't always mean necessarily that they're handing you papers and you're signing that you received them. If they can serve you legally, then the court will count that as service and process. So you'll want to make sure that you're checking into what your state considers legal service and process for consumer debts. So this method of service depends on the state that you're in. When you're served with a lawsuit regarding a debt, it is imperative that you pay attention to the date on the notice. Your court date is when the judge will rule on your case if you do nothing. You do not want this to happen. If you're facing lawsuits, wage garnishments, bank account levies, and judgments due to old debts, your best bet is to file bankruptcy. However, if you're being served by a process server, just accept the documents, they'll be on their way. If on the documents, there's always going to be a way to contact the person that's suing you. If that's a creditor, sometimes you can intervene at that point if you feel confident in doing so and try to arrange for a payment plan. Sometimes you can. Whether or not you should depends on how many other debts you have. For instance, you owe a credit card, like you defaulted on one of your credit cards, and you owe them $2,500. And now they're taking you to court and they're serving you with legal paperwork. They've tried contacting you, you haven't answered their phone calls, you just ignored them, whatever happened, you moved around, whatever happened. So now they're suing you for $2,500. So if you have 10 credit cards that you owe $2,500 on, you should probably just file bankruptcy. You know, if you just have the one, you could potentially call that creditor and see if you can work out a payment plan. I said call the creditor. Write to the creditor. Don't call them. Write to the credit. Write to the creditor and see if they can work out a payment plan or a settlement. Sometimes they'll even be willing to work out half. We'll go into more about settlements in a future course, the next course actually, but even if it gets to the lawsuit point, you don't always have to file bankruptcy. Filing bankruptcy, again, should be a last resort. Absolute last resort. But anyway, if you are facing many lawsuits, wage garnishments, bank account levies, and judgments due to old debts, your best bet might be to file bankruptcy. What that means is wage garnishments is essentially if it gets to the point where you're getting your wages garnished or your bank account frozen, that means that you've ignored process servers and you've received a default judgment. So if it's gotten to that point where you're getting your wages garnished, bank account levies, you might as well file bankruptcy because that's the only way out of it. Again, we'll talk about that more later. But if you haven't yet got to the point where your wages are getting garnished and your bank account's getting frozen, there's still hope that you could potentially get a settlement. There's still hope. So, some final tips and takeaways from course 2 before we go into course 3. If you have a lot of debt collectors calling you, send them all a cease and desist letter, and by law, they have to stop. So that helps with a little bit of the stress. Never agree to any payment arrangement over the phone. Always communicate in writing and get the details in writing before you agree to anything. Memorize the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and keep a log of any violations that might occur so that you can sue them later. Ignore lawsuits at your own peril. Again, don't ignore lawsuits. Just don't. If you're being served with a lawsuit, just take it. It's better to know. You don't want to get a default judgment in a consumer debt lawsuit. So ignore lawsuits at your own peril. Settlement offers and lawsuits and disputes will be covered in the next class. So thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, night, what have you.